The HBO miniseries on Chernobyl stands out as one of the biggest successes in recent TV show making. Surely that cannot possibly have anything to do with Soviet propaganda crafted by the people the show's creator, Craig Mazin, refers to as masters of weaponized narration. This man probably very few of you recognized, if anyone. His name is Grigory Medvedev, the author of Chernobyl Notebook, or alternatively, The Truth About Chernobyl. According to one cover, the work is described as an exciting minute-by-minute account by a leading Soviet nuclear physicist on the world's largest nuclear disaster and cover-up. Alternatively, Medvedev is described as a nuclear power specialist who worked for a time at the Chernobyl AES and knows it well, just as he is personally acquainted with all the principal participants in the events. How well did this former worker actually know the Chernobyl nuclear power plant? Behold this paragraph. Despite Medvedev evidently being aware that the control rods were comprised of two sections, neutron-absorbing boron and water-displacing graphite, each of which was in the ballpark of 5 meters long, our erudite author claims that 5 meters worth of graphite, in addition to 1 meter worth of empty space, are the first to enter the core from above, when control rods are fully extracted. These are the fictional graphite tips that make no sense whatsoever because they literally make no sense whatsoever. The graphite displacers were located symmetrically in the centre of the core when control rods were maximally extracted, so as to displace neutron-absorbing water columns and increase the reactivity worth of control rods. Rather than having the neutron-absorbing boron sections move into neutron-absorbing water areas, graphite displacers absorbing less neutrons than water provided a greater differential, making control rod movement more effective in either direction. Also, if the graphite sections followed by the boron sections entered the core from above, the control rods would have stuck out into the reactor hull. A ludicrous mistake like this on a fundamental aspect of the disaster by someone touted as being a nuclear specialist of particular familiarity with Chernobyl and its circumstances is a big red flag. Possibly with a hammer and sickle on it. Grigory Medvedev and his book are clearly one of the principal sources the HBO miniseries relied on. Alexander Kupny, a Chernobyl liquidator employed by the nuclear power plant for 21 years between 1988 and 2009 with his own YouTube channel in Russian, reacted to the miniseries. In one video, Kupny singles out a few of the dubious sources the miniseries relied on. The comments about Medvedev's book are as follows. Almost the same I can say about Chernobyl Notebook by Medvedev. According to true Chernobyl nuclear power plant workers, including senior reactor operators, unit control room workers, they say that this book is written by order. That is probably some party members were behind this novel. That is again called documentary. They needed it to be published. They needed to spread among the masses the information that the main perpetrator of the Chernobyl accident is personnel. The video then cuts to a statement by Alexei Fatahov, a former Chernobyl senior reactor control engineer and instructor, who says the following. When I started to watch, I couldn't understand from the beginning what this reminds me of. Then I realised it is 80% the book of Grigory Medvedev, Chernobyl Notebook of 1989. All the names, sequences, everything filmed in this series fit the book. The film is related to the reality equally like the book is. All the bloopers and intentional lies written by Medvedev in the book on the request to tarnish Dyatlov, Chernobyl nuclear power plant personnel. Episode 5 of the miniseries is its gripping and chilling climax. Its title is Eternal Memory. Memory is a funny thing, particularly when it is eternal. In the coming videos, we will explore some of the key things Episode 5 misremembers, twisting the memory of Chernobyl and of the people involved. We begin where the script begins, with the motivation of Chernobyl management to force through the performance of the turbine rundown safety test. According to the script on the 25th of April 1986, Chief Engineer Nikolai Fomin is sitting with Deputy Chief Engineer Anatoly Dyatlov in Plant Director Viktor Bryukhanov's office. These are the three stooges at the top of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant hierarchy we later see in the courtroom being duly prosecuted. Fomin says Brykhanov's promotion beyond the nuclear power plant is dependent on the completion of the safety test. Fomin himself will elevate to plant director, with Dyatlov potentially elevating to the chief engineer of the plant. Brykhanov enters in a foul mood, informing his management associates that they will have to wait. In reality, Brykhanov was a soft-spoken man, but in the script he cuts off Fomin 2 words into a question with, "You going to ask me if there's a problem, Nikolai? You can't read a fucking face?" His odiously entertaining character stays consistent from here. Brykhanov goes on to say that he has been waiting for 3 years to complete this test, now with the association of attaining his promotion. It'll become even easier to read in between the lines that these 3 men didn't care much about the safety test itself. What they proceed to discuss is the Kyiv delay, a linchpin in the episode's narrative. Brykhanov asks Dyatlov if this delay will cause instability issues. Dyatlov says it won't and that he'll personally be there for the test. Brykhanov likes Dyatlov's assurance that the test will be completed, and Fomin has a private moment, running his fingers covetously along the edge of Brykhanov's desk. According to Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl, the untold story of the world's greatest nuclear disaster, the story was different. By the spring of 1986, Chernobyl was, officially, one of the best performing nuclear stations in the Soviet Union, and the word was that Brykhanov's loyalty to the party would soon be rewarded. According to the results of the latest 5-year plan, the plant was due to receive the state's highest honour, the Order of Lenin. The staff would win a financial bonus, and Brykhanov would be awarded the Star of the Hero of Socialist Labour. At the Minister of Energy, the decision had already been taken to promote Brykhanov to Moscow, and Fomin would take his place as plant director. The news would be announced on the May 1st holiday, with a decree of the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet. In a Politburo meeting after the disaster, the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Energy, Gennady Shasharin, stated that, in the ministry, Chernobyl was considered exemplary. Appointed the best director. The International INSAG 1 report noted that Chernobyl Unit 4 was in fact the most successful RBMK unit. So, Brykhanov was the best director of the plant with the best RBMK unit that on the whole was considered exemplary. The results of the latest 5-year plan warranted that the state's highest honour win a bonus for the staff and an award for Brykhanov. These sound like adequate grounds for a promotion, but what about the test itself? While it is true that the rundown test was included in the design of RBMK plants, it was never actually completed anywhere, and apparently was only attempted at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. According to a participant in the disaster investigation, other plants wrote the test out of their regulations. The test was apparently redundant and unclear. It was the flagship Chernobyl RBMK power plant that burdened itself with seeing the test through. A 2021 newspaper article claims that the Leningrad nuclear power plant refused the test. Shortly before that tragedy, director Anatoly Pavlovich Eperin refused to conduct the kind of experiment that was carried out in Chernobyl, and no one could force him. We suspect that the safety concern the article brings up over what was supposed to be a safety test is coloured strongly in blurry hindsight. The most startling judgment we have of the test comes from a July 3rd, 1986 Politburo meeting through two different sets of notes. The speaker is Efim Slavsky, the minister of the extremely powerful Ministry of Media Machine Building that was the ultimate authority on all things nuclear. A man-made explosion was created. Why did they need this idiotic experiment? Firefighters died because of the incompetence. The reactor is good, durable. But what have they done? A regional engineer, who had no right to do it, attempted the experiment. Alternatively, Shasharin was singing here like a Bolshoi theatre performer. But he did not say what a completely senseless experiment was conducted at the MPS. Who needed that? The idea for the so-called experiment came from the chief design engineer of RBMK reactors, Nikiet, a major institute that fell under the umbrella of the Ministry of Media Machine Building. We will get to the role of the regional engineer, a probable reference to Anatoly Dyatlov, later. Suffice it to say that it was the stellar performance of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant and the major economic benefit it provided over the course of years, rather than the performance of a single peculiar test on which a chain of promotions for the plant management rested. The promotions were a foregone conclusion. Director Burkhanov was apparently unaware that this test was even taking place. The promotion motive for what happened that night appears to be an invention of the HBO miniseries, as we can't even find it in Grigory Medvedev's book. How it ended up in the script is a question for creator Craig Mazin to answer. Next, we come to the scene of Valery Legasov having an uncomfortable conversation with the head of the KGB inside a black limo. As you might already be guessing, this is fiction too. But what Episode 5 seeks to convey is an imagined reality of the Soviet state oppressing Soviet scientists. Without even looking at the drivel of the script, let's get straight into what actual sources indicate. According to INSAG 7 on page 60, merely days after the disaster, VP Volkov, apparently the main safety and reliability figure at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, provided AP Alexandrov, the director of the Kurchatov Institute, and subsequently the leaders of the Soviet Union, with an explanation of the disaster, which attributed it not to the actions of the operating personnel, but to the design of the reactor core and a lack of proper understanding of the neutron physics processes going on in it. This version suggested that the accident was caused by a positive reactivity excursion following the insertion of the reactor control and protection system rods as a result of their defective design and the large positive void coefficient of reactivity. On page 146 of her book, Producing Power, The Pre-Chernobyl History of the Soviet Nuclear Industry, researcher Sonia D. Schmid goes further. After the Chernobyl accident, Volkov sent the report he had written to Alexandrov back in the 1970s to the prosecutor's office. Almost instantaneously, by the 1st of May 1986, he was banned from entering his workplace, the Institute of Atomic Energy. Volkov promptly wrote letters to Mikhail Gorbachev, to the chairman of the Council of Ministers, Nikolai Ryzhkov, and to the Attorney General, A. Rakunkov. In the letters, he argued the accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was caused not by the actions of the operating personnel, but by the construction of the active zone and the lack of understanding of the processes taking place in it. A loss of coolant in the active zone led to an increase of reactivity, which led to the destruction of the reactor. Then, in an endnote on page 289, Schmid points out that she was not able to personally view Volkov's report, but that apparently Volkov even listed the names of those he considered culpable for the Chernobyl catastrophe. Guilty for what has happened are the scientific director, IAE, or the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, the chief designer Nikiet, and also Minenergo, the Ministry of Energy operating RBMK reactors. This nexus of guilty parties reminds us of the following quote in Politburo session notes. "Did you know before that the reactor was unreliable?" "Yes, but you will not find it in the papers. There was great resistance. Alexandrov was opposed. The Academy of Sciences was also. The Ministry of Medium Machine Building demanded that we increase production of energy at nuclear power stations by the year 2000. So the main safety and reliability person at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy referred his top boss, director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy and president of the Soviet Academy of Sciences, Anatoly Alexandrov, to the prosecutor's office. Volkov ran to the state, rather than run from it. Volkov was adamant that the Chernobyl disaster was not due to the actions of the operators. His name appears once more in SAG 7. This is an apparent direct citation from one of his reports. The first quoted paragraph identifies multiple factors. The second paragraph points a finger. The scale of the Chernobyl accident was therefore not determined by personnel actions, but by a lack of understanding, primarily on the part of the scientific managers, of the effect of steam quality on the reactivity of the RBMK core. This led to an incorrect analysis of the operational safety, to a disregard of repeated manifestations of the large void reactivity effect during operation, to a false confidence in the effectiveness of the reactor control and protection system, which, in fact, failed to cope with both the Chernobyl accident and many others, in particular with design basis accidents, and, naturally, to the formulation of incorrect operating procedures. Volkov argues that the Chernobyl disaster was due to scientific ignorance and mismanagement at the highest levels. He even points out that the operating instructions themselves were incorrect as a consequence of this lack of understanding, which is a topic we cover in serious detail in the Masters of Weaponized Narration series. It was not the operators who flouted the operating instructions. It was the scientists who failed to write them correctly, and after the disaster lied about them to avoid responsibility by scapegoating the operators. Volkov continues, "This inadequate level of scientific management is explained, above all, by the following. The extremely low number of studies of the neutron physics processes taking place in the RBMK core. A disregard for discrepancies in the results obtained using different methods. The lack of experimental studies under conditions close to the natural ones. The lack of analysis of specialized publications, and, in the long run, the transmission to the chief design engineer of incorrect techniques for calculating the neutron physics processes used to analyze the processes taking place in the core, and the safety of plants with RBMK reactors. It is also an important point that for a long time the USSR Ministry of Power had been operating plants with RBMK reactors with neutron physics instabilities in the core, but did not take sufficient notice of the repeated unusual signals of the emergency power protection system and of the emergency power increase rate protection system following triggering of the EPS, and did not demand thorough investigations of emergency situations. We are bound to conclude that an accident such as that at Chernobyl was inevitable. To Volkov, Chernobyl was basically a scientific failure. Inside the Politburo, the scientific failure to understand the RBMK was mentioned openly. This reactor has its own strengths. The RBMK is an industrial reactor. But it is less studied. Is that right, Comrade Legasov? Yes, that's right. Why were theoretical studies of this reactor halted and not financed? Comrade Alexandrov told me about it. He is sad about what happened. So they moved the reactor to industrial production, but further theoretical research had not been done. And yet, why wasn't theoretical research continued? Doesn't it look like voluntarism by some individuals is dragging the country into adventurism? It is true that monopolism is at quite a high level. Eventually, Soviet leader Gorbachev let loose. "We have been hearing from you. Scientists, specialists, ministers. That everything is under control here, and you expect us to look up to you as if you were gods. This is where it all started, because the ministries and all the scientific centres got out of control, and it all ended in failure. And even now I do not see that you are contemplating any conclusions. You are all just stating facts, or even trying to smooth over some of them. This is where the monopoly in science and in industry leads. The problem of energy production in every aspect, scientific, experimental, turned out to be out of control." Reads the expert opinion. "The reactor was unreliable, and you did not do anything about it. It did not raise your concern. Why weren't theoretical studies funded? Where have you been? Academician Alexandrov himself said that. But he also missed something. Today he is agonizing over it, although he bears great blame. It wasn't only Kurchatov Institute director Anatoly Alexandrov who bore blame. At the moment, we won't delve into the reasons why everyone in the Politburo was comfortable throwing the operators under the bus most of all, but we do find a curious quote at the end of one set of notes. Legasov Valery Alexandrovich, of course, it is our fault that we did not monitor this reactor. I am personally to blame for this as well. The miniseries chooses to make Legasov its hero, and he is the central protagonist of the Eternal Memory Episode 5. Let's refresh our own eternal memory with some of the Legasov tidbits we've encountered in some previous videos. Valery Legasov was the first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy, a favoured associate of director Anatoly Alexandrov. Recall the anecdote Kurchatov Institute computer specialist Alexander N. Rumyantsev shares in the second pre-Chernobyl history video. In a 1984 meeting at the Kurchatov Institute, Alexandrov and Legasov sat in the front row of the conference hall as they were being warned that the computing base of the institute does not enable adequate research to be done, and that the newest RBMK reactor units, with all the improvements implemented in them, are most susceptible to a severe incident. The risk of unfinished reactor designs was explicitly emphasized. Rumyantsev writes that Legasov reacted violently to what he heard, turning to personal insults against the speaker. Alexandrov sat quietly, but proceeded to abolish a computing department and change the plans for the construction of an expansion of the institute's computing base. After the Chernobyl disaster, Rumyantsev reports that the tapes of this meeting disappeared from the archives, and that while Legasov promised to include him on the team analysing the causes of the disaster, Rumyantsev later learned that Legasov actually instructed for Rumyantsev to be excluded. Legasov willingly portrays himself on his tapes recorded after the disaster as an ignoramus, at one point hilariously stating, "But traditional reactor engineering somehow did not interest me much, and it was not assigned to me, and it seemed rather boring." Legasov claims, on his tapes in contrast to inside the Politburo, that practically speaking he knew nothing about the RBMK reactors and had no responsibility for them. Yet Rumyantsev writes the following. E.P. Kunigin, who served as Deputy Scientific Director of the RBMK project, passed away in 1983. A.P. Alexandrov became the President of the USSR Academy of Sciences. The actual management of the reactor areas was transferred to the Deputy Director of the Institute, V.A. Legasov, a talented chemist. This comment was not lost on one of our viewers who claims to have worked under Legasov. Thanks for the video. I wasn't aware about bureaucracy aspects of USSR energy production. I didn't know V. Legasov became highly responsible person for entire reactor business of the IAE from 1981, year may be off. He used to have time to learn reactors, surprise for me. But this was not all Legasov was potentially hiding. Recall another anecdote, this time from Chernobyl Task Force note-taker Georgy Kopczynski. At the end of the second Masters of Weaponized narration video, Kopczynski confronted Legasov about the falsity of his initial report's conclusion, that the actions of the operators were responsible for the disaster. Legasov heard but did not respond, and neither did Alexandrov, who was also present. Legasov reportedly looked in the direction of his political ally, Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Ryzhkov, and went away. On his tapes, Legasov did not come clean. He simply reaffirmed that the actions of the operators were monstrous, and their punishment deserved. And so we come back to the black limo where the head of the KGB is bullying Legasov, who is played by an actor who seemingly got his lunch money stolen every other day when he was in school. Let's highlight a couple of misunderstandings that the script writers suffered from. The KGB boss celebrates the positive impression Legasov left at the International Vienna Conference a few months after the disaster. Legasov is morose and guilty. Well, according to Adam Higginbotham's Midnight in Chernobyl, real-life Legasov was basically the KGB person sitting on the comfortable side of the limo. Pressed by reporters on the disadvantages in the reactor design he had mentioned, Legasov replied, the defect of the system was that the designers did not foresee the awkward and silly actions by the operators. Impressed by such apparently unprecedented candour from Soviet scientists, and reassured by the idea that the disaster was an extraordinary event that had little relevance for nuclear safety outside the USSR, and that its health and environmental consequences fell within acceptable limits, the delegates left the hall confident in the future of Soviet atomic energy, and of their industry around the world. By the time they departed from Vienna at the end of the week, the mood was cheerful, almost jubilant, for the Soviet Union and for Valery Legasov personally. The conference was, a prominent British physicist remarked in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, a public relations triumph. On his return to Moscow, Legasov went directly to the Kurchatov Institute and ran up the steps to the third floor. "Victory!" he shouted to a friend. Maybe that was just the adrenaline rush. Next, we see the epitome of Episode 5's misconception and miscasting of heroes. Good boy Legasov implies that the only reason he has been lying is because the big bad Soviet government and the scary KGB wouldn't let the virtuous scientist fix the RBMK reactors otherwise. Well, according to INSAG 7, in the adult reality, we actually live in one of the indications that the Soviet scientists were lying is how quickly they got around to fixing the RBMK reactors, predating the Vienna meeting. The Commission considers that the negative properties of this type of reactor are likely to predetermine the inevitability of emergency situations, and that they certainly do not demonstrate that such situations are likely to be extremely rare, and would occur only in the event of an extremely improbable combination of reactor operating procedures and conditions adopted by the unit personnel. Thus, it seems that the reactor designers were well aware of the possible dangerous consequences of the reactor characteristics and understood how the safety of the RBMK 1000 reactor could be improved. This is confirmed by the fact that the main technical measures to enhance the safety of the RBMK 1000 reactor were announced less than a month and a half after the accident. You can read what these measures included. These measures obviously do not tally with the official version. which blamed the accident entirely on personnel errors. According to the script, the KGB man, representative of the state, wants to reward Legasov for lying with an award he did not receive and with a promotion to the director of the Kurchatov Institute. The actual director Alexandrov intended for him, but that did not happen either. Allow us to digress with our theory as to why these positive outcomes for Legasov did not occur. One apparently yanked by Soviet leader Gorbachev, and the latter precluded by a vote against Legasov at the Kurchatov Institute of Atomic Energy. As usual, our take is ironic. Much of what you may read about Legasov is positive. It is not only the miniseries that mistakenly casts him as our hero. Our approach to Chernobyl has been different, starting from the bottom up and branching out. Our observations of the concrete lies and political statements Legasov had made render us extremely sceptical of the man. We see him not as a man of positive stories, but as someone who was consistently on the wrong side of history, before and after the disaster. He lied about the safety of Soviet reactors before Chernobyl, and he lied about Chernobyl after Chernobyl. He was also wrong about the safety fears he voices on his tapes, and he never set the record straight on the lies he told against the operators. As we have examined the extent and purpose of the lies he successfully told against the operators, and as we have come across various statements about his role, very much including his own, our strong inclination is that Valery Legasov was a fairly sinister figure. We believe that the following sums up why things started to go downhill for Legasov after his initial success at the Vienna meeting lying his butt off. One senior scientific colleague from the Kurchatov Institute wrote, not anonymously, that Legasov was a clear representative of that scientific mafia whose political leanings instead of scientific leadership led to the Chernobyl accident. We first encountered this remarkable quote on Wikipedia, and confirmed it inside the proper source. This is a 1994 book from the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. At the time, we were able to view page 34 in full, but by using the word mafia in the search, you can still pull up a partial quote. Amusingly, the author dismisses this not anonymous claim from a senior Kurchatov Institute scientist as nothing more than professional jealousy. However, some American writing from Washington, D.C. was not aware of many things a senior scientist at the Kurchatov Institute would be aware of. We suspect that as time passed, and the reality of what actually happened at Chernobyl and how it was covered up crystallized, to an exclusive group of people at least, Valery Legasov was repudiated. What guilt he actually suffered from, he took to his grave.